What are the planetary nodes? So most people in astrology understand that the moon has a nodal axis. It's less understood that all planets have nodes. Any planetary body that crosses the ecliptic forms a nodal axis. So the only luminary that doesn't is the sun, and that's because it's the Earth's apparent motion around the sun that creates the ecliptic. So only the sun doesn't create nodes. Every other planetary body creates nodes. My work in this book is based on the planetary nodes of Jupiter outwards. So the planetary nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, Neptune, Chiron. And I'll explain as I go along why I chose those parameters, but that's what I mean by collective evolution. We're starting to look at what is the actual evolutionary axis of the planets themselves. And we raise the question, how are the archetypal principles related to the planets themselves evolving? Now, Rudhyar is absolutely clear in one of his phenomenal late pamphlets. You know, Rudhyar is a difficult person to read. There are entire Rudhyar books which seem disappointing, which seem just full of theosophical fluff. And yet there are pamphlets of Rudhyar's that are so profound it could change the course of astrology if they were grasped. And I feel that's the case of the 1971 pamphlet, The Planetary and Lunar Nodes, which this work began when I stumbled across that pamphlet. I also think, for example, in the psychological work that he did, the pamphlet From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology is also just beautiful and brilliant. But all of this work started by me reading Dane Rudhyar's The Planetary and Lunar Nodes, although the planetary nodes' existence were made known to me by Green in person when I studied with him in London in 1999. Now, Rudhyar is absolutely clear. You cannot separate the South and North node. Think about this for a moment. Think about the whole world of natal astrology at this moment in time, the books about the nodes of the moon and the soul, the books about the nodes of the moon that separate the north node and say, you need to do this, or they separate off the south node and say, don't do this anymore. It's bad. You've done it already, whatever. Rudhyar is absolutely withering about this kind of thinking. He is absolutely clear that they have to be considered as two poles of an electrical charge, that there's no way you could separate one from the other. In fact, a huge part of his point is that, as we'll go on to see, the nodes together are effectively describing an arc of motion. So it takes the 2 points to describe the arc. And then he goes further. In this vision of orbital astrology that he has, Rudhyar says something quite profound. This is a quote. I won't read most of the quotes on the slides because I trust that you can read them. But this is worth a few moments. The planet as a moving small disk of light in the sky is something that the personal consciousness can normally perceive, while the entire orbit of that planet is a cosmic fact which transcends sense perception. So the point being that the nodes, as points describing a parabola of motion, describe an entire orbital path and are therefore, he asserts, more significant than individual planetary placements. So he is saying, let's just underline it for a second because Rudhyar speak is quite dense and philosophical. In Rudhyar speak, he is saying that the lunar nodes are more important than the moon. He is saying that the nodes of Saturn might tell you more about the evolution of the structure of civilization than the position of Saturn itself. So he is wanting us to see the individual and event chart as a dynamic system of motion. So let's think about this parabola of motion. Think about it, that point at the end of the cannonball, and if you like, the point where the cannonball hits the earth. They are 2 points describing an arc of motion, you could, from those 2 points, hypothetically calculate its entire motion if there was no Earth to stop it, if it did not just hit the Earth. The nodes are like that. They are 2 points describing a parabola of motion. So in effect, they have to be understood together, otherwise they don't describe the arc of motion. So what this would be saying is, if you single out the north node, and many astrology softwares only put the north node in, for example. I know that it implies the south node as an opposition point with the nodes of the moon. But there's a lot of thinking that separates the nodes. But Rudhyar is making the point, you then lose the whole arc of motion. It's only because you have 2 points. A single point does not give you enough intel to describe the arc of motion. It takes both points. So both points are essential in order to describe an evolutionary arc of motion. And then he goes on. So first point to grasp, the nodes are so important because they describe an arc of motion, because they are 2 points that describe an entire evolutionary arc. And then the second point is, these 2 nodes are formed when the planet intersects the ecliptic. So the plane that they intersect is also important. The nodes are important because they reveal the whole arc of motion, but they reveal that arc of motion whilst they intersect the ecliptic. And the ecliptic represents the symbolic relationship between the Earth and Sun. And the symbolic relationship between the Earth and Sun, Rudhyar argues, is effectively the spiritual symbolism of our solar system. That the Sun is the center, the kind of logos, if you like, the fiery heart of our entire world, and it also drives the biological life on planet Earth. So the Sun is a symbol of an integration point of the entire solar system, and therefore all the other planetary bodies. So effectively, the ecliptic represents the Earth's relationship to the integration of the whole. And it's the ecliptic, of course, which contains the different zodiacal constellations. It contains the zodiac. So the nodes are significant because they describe an entire arc of motion, but they're also significant because they describe that arc of motion whilst crossing the ecliptic, which is the symbolic journey of the Earth's evolution with regard to the Sun. And these are the 2 reasons, in a nutshell, why Rudhyar thought the lunar and planetary nodes were more important than individual planetary placements. Pretty strong stuff from, this is Rudhyar maybe what, a few years before his death? Very much his late thought, his mature thought. And here he is again, absolutely clear. What is at stake is the fundamental relationship of a planet to the Earth's evolutionary condition, if you like. So the planetary nodes, he is effectively saying, nodes are formed at this fundamental relational point. Nodes are formed across the ecliptic, which itself speaks of the fundamental relationship between the Earth and the Sun, and therefore speaks of the evolutionary potential of our life on Earth. The planetary nodes then, they're formed, so the planetary nodes of Saturn are formed when Saturn intersects the Earth-Sun relationship. So the planetary nodes of Saturn tell us an awful lot about the evolutionary concerns of Saturn over larger historical periods, and the way that the issues pertaining archetypally to Saturn shape life on Earth with regard to its spiritual evolution, Earth in relationship to the Sun. That's the thinking that he encapsulates in the first part of that pamphlet in 1971. He's talking about the planetary nodes as early as the Astrology of Personality in 1936. So Rudhyar has studied these points for decades. But it's this pamphlet that contains his mature thinking on these placements.